Okay, before we get started, I just want to encourage everybody to take a moment and appreciate the community you're a part of. Not just nerds who use our off work time to work for 3 days, but the whole extended family of history educators. We are so glad you're here. And while the conference is free, we could not put on this kind of event without help from a lot of people. Leaders from Arizona, Maryland, Ohio, Oregon, Utah, Washington, the World History Association were all essential in making this event happen. So if you enjoy this conference as much as we think you will, do us a favor. Take a moment to join your local state council for the social studies. Join the WHA. It isn't much, but it makes a huge difference. Check out our contributors page for details.
Hi, OER conference goers, and welcome back. Our first live discussion today is on literacy. Now, seeing as your host is Abby Reisman, an associate professor of teacher education at University of Pennsylvania, you will not have to stress about how we're going to navigate this broad and pretty urgent topic. Prior to her arrival at UPenn's Graduate School of Education, Dr. Reisman was a visiting professor at Teachers College Columbia University and a researcher at the National Center for Research on Evaluation Standards and Student Testing at UCLA. She received her PhD from Stanford University, where she directed the Reading Like a Historian project in San Francisco, the first extended history curriculum intervention in urban high schools. Joining Abby today, we have Erik Christensen and Andrew Del Calvo. Erik is a fifth-year history teacher at Granada Hills Charter in Los Angeles, California. He has developed instructional materials that are globally published, and he has won numerous awards for his work with students, including the Outstanding Rookie Teacher of the Year in 2020, awarded by the California Council for Social Studies. At the same time, this rookie is a veteran at OER Project, and we really value his contributions to the community. Andrew Del Calvo is currently a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania. Formerly, he taught 9th and 10th grade social studies and was department chair at Harvest Collegiate High School in New York City. One of his main areas of interest is finding ways to use one-on-one writing conferences to support students in overcoming challenges they encounter when writing about history. Abby, Erik, and Andrew, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Maheen. Hi, Andy and Erik. I'm excited to speak with you for this next hour. And I want to take a second to frame our conversation, right? So this is literacy in the social studies. And I think that if I were to enter a time machine and beam myself back about 50 years, this would seem like a very strange conversation. But I think the last decade, even a little bit more, has really centered literacy in the social studies with Common Core and now C3, centering inquiry. And I think part of the puzzle is also that there are so many resources that have been digitized and available to teachers. You know, we don't have to search too hard to find amazing resources online. And I think there's also this added piece that literacy and critical thinking is really an essential piece of citizenship, right? And that if we don't have students who do that work, we're really not doing our job. So that's a big charge, a big responsibility, perhaps not something that every social studies teacher kind of signed up for to do literacy work in the classroom. And so I want to begin with just a really big, messy question of, you know, what is literacy in the social studies classroom? What does it look like? And how do you understand it as part of your work? Erik, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I like to think of literacy, or probably the plural form, right? Literacies. I like to think of them as this sort of big, happy cloud that surrounds a classroom, right? And that cloud is going to move with students into their life beyond high school, of course, right? So it's this all-encompassing, all-surrounding set of skills and knowledge that really students have to figure out how to pack up and take with them in its various forms as they move on through their lives. So with that, it is a big, messy question. I don't know where we draw the line around literacy, and I know we're going to be talking about many of those different forms as we move through today.
Excellent.
And I guess just to kind of build on that, I really kind of focus it on sense making and interpretation, and providing students with tools to do that. So I think, I think literacy is really, we think about like the social practices associated with this, and giving students a lot of access to those practices explicitly. So a lot of my work is really like invested in kind of making those things explicit. And I think like a lot of literacy is really just giving students access to those things and equity of that in particular.
All right, so it's everything, and it's also this, you didn't say empowerment, but I heard it all the way through your comment, Andy, right? That there's a sort of agency of power that we give kids when we give them the opportunities to practice literacy. So let's roll with that for a second. So you talked about sense making. If I were to teach, I don't know, I won't be able to do this off the top of my head, but clearly we don't mean handing out like, a random flyer from the street, or maybe we do, I don't know, but something that's not related to the content. It's not just reading, just to read text, just to practice reading comprehension. There's something else that we're talking about. Can we dive into this idea of sense making? Like, what does it mean to give kids opportunities to engage in sense making? I don't know which one of you wants to kind of start us on that road.
I'll let Andrew kick that one off, and then I have some ideas that I think I can probably build on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this starts with the question. And Abby, this is like really building off a lot of your work too, right? Is that like we begin with a question that's going to force students to create interpretations. Rather than just asking them to, summarize or like in many ways sort of regurgitate stuff, begins with a question that forces them to take a stance. And so like a core part of literacy is engaging students explicitly in that sense making work so that they're forced to sort of engage with a particular perspective. And how we give, again, our moves as teachers becomes like giving them tools to do that in rigorous ways and in ways that will be humanizing and that will allow them to sort of bring out parts of themselves in these interpretations. So it's not just like, it doesn't feel like we're just doing intellectual gymnastics.
Okay.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I like how Andrew brought up, like, we start with a question, right? And I know many people in our audience are familiar with like the backwards planning concept of what do we want our students to know? What are we working on? What are the big questions that we're going to be wrestling with? And when we take that approach, right, that really informs these different sources, these different materials, these different everything, right, that we can put in front of students that can fit into that question, right? And then the sort of teacher magic sort of happens, and we learn how to weave these different sources together to drive that conversation or to drive students towards that investigative process for that question. But I really like to pin it what Andrew said there. Like, it's really, really, really important to know where things are going, right? Where is this question going? Where is this class going? Where is this unit going? Where is this lesson going? And that is all centered around those big questions.
So it sounds like the word literacy hides a lot of planning that the teacher is doing. And I'm having some trouble in hearing both of you speak, differentiating this from probably what was talked about in the session. I think there was a session yesterday on inquiry. Where does designing inquiry end and literacy instruction begin?
Yeah, so I've been trying to like sort of visualize that as this conference has gone on over the last few days. And what I've kind of come up with, and feel free to argue with me, everyone, but literacy is sort of this hub that holds together all of these different tracks that we've been talking about the last couple of days, right? So if we think of a hub of a wheel, literacy could be in the middle, because it then connects to engaging students. It connects to inquiry. It connects to media studies. It connects to searching for evidence. It connects to climate studies, right? All of these different tracks and ideas that so many amazing teachers have put out there. I feel like it really comes down to literacy being this sort of hub that connects everything together.
And I guess within that, I just think a lot about the practices that are involved when we get into literacy. We can talk about like inquiry as more of the arc. Literacy involves the particular, often domain specific. So often like specific to history, we're going to kind of engage with particular practices, or specific to geography or psych, whatever. And so I think that's kind of where I tend to draw the line, is inquiry is that like larger arc. And then when we're getting into literacy, we're really getting into these like particular practices. And the ones that I'm really interested in, the historical ones, but there's obviously a whole breadth of ones, like Erik, you talk about in your track talk.
Probably history is an important one to a lot of people here at the conference, I'm presuming. Erik, I love this analogy of the wheel, not only because it's a nice way to tie everything together, but it also centers this talk. You're basically saying this is the most important talk in the conference. So that's great. Let's do it. So I want to circle back to this, right? Because I really think it helps frame what we're trying to do here. This isn't literacy like, how do I do the textbook or how do I do this document? It's literacy as the engine or as the center of the wheel that's really pushing all of the inquiry work that we're trying to build in our classrooms. So then I have to face the elephant in the room, another mixing metaphors here, right? But how do you do this work? And I know that a lot of teachers that I've worked with across the country, want to do literacy, and then they bring some sort of sources into their classroom and it becomes really challenging, right? And they run into a number of obstacles. So I want us to get into we'll come back to the big picture at the end, but I just want to kind of really dive into the nitty gritty. And starting with you, Erik, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Your track, you're like, look at this thing. Kids need to know all this stuff to tackle it. How do you do that? How are you giving them the vocab? How are you giving them the background knowledge? How are you giving them the, the mathematical skills? Like, help us. How are you doing this?
Yeah, so great question. And for those of you who have seen that talk, right, I start out with that really gnarly, like super complex chart. But one of the things that I say in there very intentionally is students need to have an operating knowledge of the vocabulary first and foremost. And so in my classes, and I have a really diverse set of student population, we start out our on-ramp to the course, to everything we do, our on-ramp is vocabulary. And it's not just these like gymnastics. I love that thought that Andrew had too. It's not just learning the words, right? Because we can all learn what new words mean. Students have to put these words to use, right? They have to use them in a genuine way. And so very early on, and in the OER project courses, the vocabulary is like there, like a menu to just pick from, right? But we really work hard in our class in putting these words to use, right? We can play games with them. We can kind of have magic words that when students use them, right, we have a little bell we can ring. There's all kinds of different ways that we can encourage students to use vocabulary. And what happens once students have practiced with vocab for a week or 2 weeks or longer is all of a sudden you can see the sense making starting to take place, like Andrew said, right? Occasionally they'll use words in maybe like the not appropriate way, like they think they know what it means, but they don't. But eventually students start figuring out what these words mean. Now, I could talk about vocab for days. It's one of my passions. I'm not going to, but I will say, I'll repeat my point here, that without vocab, I think that students really feel lost in a history classroom or a social studies classroom more broadly. And so that's what we use as an on-ramp to kind of introduce students to literacy, like without telling them that's what we're doing, but like that's our on-ramp to where they need to go.
So I love that as an on-ramp, and I had planned to push you a little bit more about the different kind of sources like maps and charts, but I want to take a moment here with this vocab thing to talk about a phenomenon that I observe with teachers who are using documents that have some, when you talked about they use the word but not exactly correctly, right? With stuff that trips kids up. What is, one of the things that I observe that gets teachers stuck sometimes is this need to have kids really understand every little bit of the document before really using the document in a broader way. Where do you draw that line? What if a kid uses a vocab word incorrectly? Or what if they're reading a document but they misunderstand the sentence?
I think the answer to that is it's okay if they make mistakes, right? That's what we're all in school for. It's okay to wrestle with these big words that you've never seen before. And there are words, and I tell the students right out of the gate, I say, you're not going to know what some of these words mean, and that's okay, right? That's why we're all here. And so part of that struggle towards literacy in the capital L sense, right, is wrestling with these vocabulary words, among many other things that students are going to be wrestling with as well. And all of that builds into, again, I'll come back to that sense-making phrase. It all connects back to there too, right? But I think my answer to your question is, let's let them struggle, right? we're there as a teacher, as a facilitator, as an instructor, as a guide, to help them navigate that process. And it's okay if they trip up.
So Andy, I want to pose this to you, and I just want to frame this as in a clearer way than I did earlier, that we started off by saying literacy is or Erik thankfully said, the center of the wheel, right? That it's the heart, that we're using it for inquiry, that we're getting them in sense making. But comprehension is you can't use it unless you're comprehending the document, right? And comprehension runs into all sorts of, some kids are going to get stuff, some kids are not. What is your take on this? How do you wrestle with that long on-road to comprehension?
I mean, I think like a core thing, for me, it's not just the vocabulary, it's really like establishing background knowledge in important ways and making sure that like the documents are situated in a particular historical moment, and that's always true. And giving students access to that schema or the core things kind of within that historical moment is going to be really helpful for them then being able to engage with the document and do that sense making work. And it's going to be super hard, right? If they don't have that background knowledge and then we're throwing them into this historical moment, and then that moment has all these different epistemologies, like different kind of things, then they're going to be like, well, what? I don't get it, right? So for me, it really begins, establishing a lot of that background knowledge. And then, I think what you pointed out is there's this really deep tension between sort of content area and general literacy and the really domain specific or the disciplinary, in this case, like history, sourcing, corroboration, contextualization, close reading. There's a lot of tension there, right? Sometimes you'll have students who are like, really get sourcing, but then their ability to, let's say, decode will be like really hard for them. And so what do you do there? My current answer is like, this is what writing conferences do really well, because it allows me to diagnose that and figure out like, oh, wait, like this is like a reading comp issue versus, oh, this is like a really deep disciplinary issue. And they're like struggling with thinking of history as an interpretive discipline. Because those are really different problems. And if we just look at what the student's writing, often we can't uncover that, right? Just the writing won't tell us that it's a general literacy issue versus a disciplinary issue. And so, a lot of my work really is centered on trying to, how do we kind of flesh those things out? Because I think that tension is kind of at the core of where a lot of student challenges lie.
So I want to stay here for, I really appreciate that, because we now have sort of 3 buckets of setting kids up for success, right? We have we can call it vocab, but I think, Erik, there's a lot, there's other stuff, right? But let's call it the meat and potatoes, or the metaphors are all over the place today, right? But the nitty gritty, right, of what's in the documents. Then there's the kind of background knowledge that might not even be in the document, but helps situate it historically. And then there's the ways of thinking about documents, right, that kids need to be set up with and they get more practice with in the inquiry, like, should I trust it? Or what is a survey, etc. Like, what is the particular genre, or how should I think about it in terms of the reliability? So let's go through each of those a little bit more deeply. And I want to start with you, Erik. And there's a question here from Sarah Beck. I'd be curious to know from Erik if the vocabulary he chooses is general historical disciplinary vocabulary, like nouns and verbs like revolution, watershed, or if it's vocab for particular eras or themes.
Yeah, great question, Sarah. The way that I roll is that we pack together the vocab for each separate unit, right? Typically there's probably 24 or so really keywords that students will use to kind of unlock what's going on in that unit or that era. Sometimes there's more words than that, sometimes there's less. But what we've found in our classroom is that when students have a grasp of those 24 words or what have you, then we can start bringing in, and I know I'm acting as a little bit of a foil to Andrew here, but once they have the vocab kind of understood, then they're able to make a little bit more sense of what's going on with the historical content, right? With the information that we're trying to give them as it relates to what we're teaching. So the words are, back to Sarah's question, the words are specific to each unit, right? And then we have ways of tracking that and building on that and repeating some of those words as students move move through the course. I hope that answers the question.
Andy,
Very specific, sorry, I'll just say real quick, they are very specific words to each unit.
Andy, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, it's funny because it's not, I wouldn't say I'm like an anti-vocab guy, because decidedly, that's not my vibe, but that, I think that vocabulary sort of is all contextualized, right? So I tend to go building from the particular historical context and thinking about also, I think the evidence-based number is like 3 to 5 words a week for kids, something like that. It's not very many words.
Yeah.
So really being particular, for me, I'm interested in words that are going to cut across my course. So picking I'm really interested in picking 20 or 30 words total for a course, and really thinking about them as sort of core conceptual building blocks that are going to come up. And then this isn't to say that there isn't going to be vocab in documents that I'm going to highlight or at times take out, because I think it's not particularly core, because I'm doing that a ton too. But that the vocab really, for me, is connected to larger concepts. And obviously there's different ways to cut that. But I think when I think about where do I want the deepest of thinking to be, and it's I think oftentimes toggling between these larger concepts and the particular cases that students are looking at.
Real quick, since we're on this, I just saw a question fly by from Heather in the chat about students picking their own words, or are they teacher selected? The answer is a little bit of a mix. And the reason I say that is I'll come up with the words that I think are essential for that unit. But what happens next, eventually what happens next, is students are given a chance to sort of wrestle with those words. And so what might happen is we might do a free writing prompt that focuses on the big questions that we started talking about at the beginning of this talk. And I might say something like, all right, you're going to work on this for 8 minutes. That's kind of a magic number for high schoolers. You're going to work on this for 8 minutes. I want you to respond to this prompt, get your thoughts out there. And you need to use 6 words that we've been working on, right? And Andrew's right. It's never more than 10, right? 10 is the magic number of brain capacity that teenagers can do. And so students will then look at their list, and they'll be flipping back and forth in their notebooks and looking up at the word wall that we have up in the room, trying to make sense of this and selecting words that they are comfortable using and they know what they mean and can address the prompt that we're working on.
So let's keep this in the mix as kind of category 1 for setting kids up for engaging with a text that might otherwise intimidate them, right? I was about to move to category 2, which is kind of establishing background knowledge, like what Andy was talking about, but I have to talk about all the other resources that Eric, you brought up. So and maybe that's a way of getting into establishing background knowledge, but maps, there's a paper I recently encountered that I should have prepared by finding, but about the number of, graphical representations and charts in textbooks that are, a 4th grade textbook where a lot of the charts require skills that they encounter in 8th grade, So how do you support them in deciphering those, or do you just reconfigure them? I mean, how do you do that, Eric?
Well, not to sound like a broken record, but it really depends on what we're asking students to do with it, right? We're not just throwing resources at kids. I know sometimes it might feel like that's what we do, but really that's not what we're doing. We are delivering them or handing them resources that will helpfully move them forward where the course is going, right? And when we get into things like maps or data tables, or I don't know, even videos or audio recordings that we're working on to make sense, there are specific strategies for each of those, but I think the overall, the overarching concept for those is students need the time to process what's going on in there, and that's the struggle teachers always have is I don't have time to do that, or it's easier for me just to tell them to read chapter 6, right, in our World Heritage or whatever. But I think if we slow down just a little bit and really focus on those big overarching concepts that we want them to come away with, that will buy time to deal with all of these other resources that students, like you said, aren't going to get at first. And that's totally cool. That's okay. But as the course progresses, as they progress vertically through the grade bands, hopefully they'll see this stuff again and remember, oh, that's what I did with Mr. Del Calvo that year. And I remember looking at maps and like, I know what the prime meridian is, and I remember that. And so I think I'm going somewhere else now, but I think where I'm going to is that the students really need time to deal with these different resources. And if it's not all the time in your class, hopefully we can cross our fingers and it'll be the next year and the next year after that and the next year after that.
And I think just to build off that, I think the other, going back to, if we're going to go back to vocab, is giving them some sort of domain specific vocabulary to talk about this stuff, so that there's something to grasp when we're starting to kind of bring an analytical framework. So like if I'm teaching art history, I think having background, foreground, middle ground, having some basic words to talk about color can be really helpful in terms of just like starting to be able to frame analytically what it means to engage with that particular type of source. And my kind of larger argument is that like we need to give kids access to different sort of domain specific ways of thinking. Like we can't just throw maps at them and just be like, hey, it's a map, good luck. There's really particular things. And, and within that, I think it really, like with maps, I think about like spiraling in difficulty. So we may give some really easy maps with keys that are very clear towards the beginning. And then we can kind of, as a course goes along, can really work towards more complexity once they kind of understand sort of the layout of a map, probably have some different concepts for reading maps. But really that spiral and continuing to touch upon, if you care about maps, right? Again, that has to be like a particular thing in a course. I'm all about less is more. I'm going to have some courses where I'm going to care a lot about maps, other ones where maybe not so much, right? But if that's your thing, take that time and really, like, Eric was saying, slow it down and then keep going back to it and spiraling and touching upon maps. Maybe it's every Monday we're doing maps. Cool, that's great.
So it sounds like one thing I'm hearing is that no matter what source or text or artifact you're using, that you have to take that beat beforehand to say, what are kids going to need, what skills, what particular vocabulary words, what XYZ are they going to need, and what might they trip up on in reading this. So you're not going to Library of Congress, downloading something and throwing it in the Xerox machine, right? You're thinking, what do they need and how do I set that up? And I think that's a really important, because we live in an age where there's so many resources online and you can roll out of bed, get to school, hit print and go, it's important to not do that, right? And to think about your kids and what they might, need to engage meaningfully with the source. I want to just, this relates to where I'm going to, but I just want to ask like a really straightforward question that relates to what Sarah Beck has here in the question and answer. When you give kids a source, a chart, a document, a letter, a map, do you have like a clear goal of what you want them to take out of it?
Yeah, usually. I think especially, so I'm usually, most of my inquiries are bounded. So that by bounded, I mean like they have a clear sort of frame where we're going to be focusing on, and there are particular perspectives that I know that kids are going to pick up from. So each document sort of tells part of this story that I want them to engage with, and provides a particular perspective, which they can take or leave. I'm not asking them to take a particular one of those two. It's not always binary, right? Some documents have like 3 different interpretations. But for me, it's all about the curation, right? Coming up with like, okay, this document set provides this set of perspectives that is going to then allow them to engage in the question in these 5 to 6 ways. And I'm fine with whichever one of those ways they engage with it, and I'm going to press them, and like we're going to work in sort of deepening our how we engage with the question and our sort of how we interpret it. And that's a big emphasis there too, is like, I don't consider these answers, I consider these interpretations, and I vehemently push back against kids who say I have the answer. Right. And so it becomes like, okay, I have you have an interpretation, right? And so like, I think that move is really, really helpful. But yeah, I totally have an idea for each document, like what a kid's gonna get out of it. What
about you, Eric?
Well, I was gonna quiz the audience here and see if they could figure out the whole key to Andrew's method there. I'll give away the answer, but it's focused on that question that he's already developed, right? And so that question really helps set up those guardrails where he wants the students to operate within, right? And so again, yeah, we all have days where we roll out of bed and like, oh God, I forgot to like set something up today. But if at the beginning of the year or in January or sometime whenever, if teachers can think through those big questions and really lock those in ahead of time, then it becomes so easy to find those sources and those materials that can fit in those questions. So you can, by setting those up, you can afford yourself a little time to sleep in from time to time, right? Because you know you're coming back to that question. And guess what? Students know you're coming back to that question too. And so it really helps signpost where things are going. It really helps keep students, I know that students sometimes are hard to keep engaged, but if they know where they're going, if they know what we're going to be talking about generally in class today, if they know what they're going to be working on, that really sets them up for a higher grader of engagement, a higher level of engagement, a higher degree of success as they move through your course. Those questions, that's the key thing there.
So we're talking about just where we've been and where we're going. So we're talking about kind of literacy as the center of this wheel, right? That all inquiry runs through literacy, because if they have a question and we want them to seek evidence, that evidence is going to require some sort of literacy, right? And then that's the scary part of doing this kind of instruction, right? Because how do we support teachers in doing it? And we had a robust conversation about how to kind of think about vocabulary, how to limit it, how, you know, Andy, you didn't say this explicitly, but I happen to know that you modify. So if you kind of have your bank of, you know, your 8 top words or 20 top words, you're going to change some of the words in the documents, right? Just
all the time
to streamline it, right? So we can talk about that too. The other 2 buckets, though, that you talked about, Andy, earlier, were establishing background knowledge, which is different, right? It's not about the knowledge that's in the documents, it's kind of the knowledge that's around the documents. And also kind of setting them up to encounter the document in a disciplinary way, right? To kind of think about the questions that somebody in that discipline, let's say history, but also geography, might ask. Can you talk a little bit about how you do those 2 things before or maybe during kids' encounter with sources?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think, Abby, to name drop you, a lot of your work sort of like does that really explicitly. Like a lot of the SHAG stuff, there's like particular moves that I think are really useful, just like having kids engage with a timeline, doing a short 5-minute lecture, right? All of those are really great ways to just, again, what I always ask myself, what is the minimum? It doesn't need to be everything. What is the minimum that students need to be able to engage with the documents in meaningful ways? And that's what I'm going to try to get. That's where I'm going to try to get them. It could be a short 5-minute YouTube video. You'll notice like 5 minutes is kind of the jam for all of these. With a longer inquiry, you can spend a whole day doing the establishing background knowledge. I get that. I've done that too. But really, I think about it as like these little 5-minute, ideally max 10-minute snippets that are going to get students really excited about the documents. And they tend to be kind of teacher-centered, or, you know, if it's, you know, could be students reading a textbook, but they tend to be a little bit more didactic and not, but still exciting, right? Because that's where the question is. They're really big for setting up the question. But yeah, and I think, again, like, this is why I find writing conferences so helpful. Sometimes you don't know whether students like actually got that, whether they have the background knowledge. Right. And in these one-on-one interactions, often if you have a whole class, every kid's like, oh yeah, I get it, blah, 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 blah. But if you're talking to one kid and you're like, wait, like, you didn't realize you're missing kind of this key part, which like is where the documents actually like make sense, then I can respond to them and be like, okay, let me just talk at you for like 3 minutes. I'm going to give you some context and then we're going to go back to the documents. But that conversation doesn't happen in a whole class environment, right? Every kid is just like, yeah, I get it. Right? Nobody wants to be that kid who's like, I don't get it.
So let's I wanted to kind of bound the conversation about text, because that's how people typically think of literacy first, is kind of reading. But then there's this like messy beast of writing, okay? And it's there, okay? And, you know, this panel is set up as if, you know, Erik is the reading guy and Andy is the writing guy, but we've already seen that there's no way to do writing without reading. There's no way to do reading without writing, right? So you're both guys. But I want to start with what you just ended with, Andy, which is why. I mean, anyone who's taught in a classroom with anywhere near 30 kids is watching your track and being like, you've got to be kidding me. Individual conferences, there's no way this is happening. So can we just start there? Because I think if we don't start there and tackle that first, it's just like, it's like, just come on, talk to me. How is this happening?
So a few things that are really important. And I kind of go over this for my track talk, so check that out if you're curious. The first thing is that, like, if you are doing individual conferences, there's the elephant in the room is that you have 33 other kids, right, who are still in the room. And so that has to be dealt with. But going back to your question, I'll talk about that in a second, but going back to your question about like why conferences, students' challenges in the composing process, when they're writing about history, we often just get the essay. And that gives us it's like a particular data point. That's just the end product. What we don't know, and that gives us some things that we can deduce, like that they were struggling with, blah, 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 blah. But we don't actually know, like, hey, turned out it was like general reading comp strategies that they were really struggling with. And that's why their interpretations of the documents are so weird, right? I can't get that from the essay, but I can get that if the student is talking to me and thinking aloud as they're reading. And then I'm like, oh, wait, their comprehension monitoring is like kind of weird. Maybe I'll just give them a couple strategies. Every time we read a document, let's look for stuff that surprises us. And I'm going to like do some cognitive modeling and think aloud and show them how to do that. I don't get that if I just look at the student's final product. And then if I'm just looking at the final product, writing doesn't become a process, right? It's not something that's like ongoing. It's not a conversation. It's not like sociocultural in this like really important way. We're not building a community of writers. And so I think that's really kind of my pitch for this. Also, Sarah Beck, who asked a question earlier, is somebody who I've done a lot of work around this work with and has done a lot of this in English classrooms. So that's like kind of my pitch for it, is that like it allows us to see into how students are thinking historically in ways that we just normally don't get to. And then you're like, okay, but what about the other 33 kids? Fair. My general argument is that like this is a great time to do in EB, establish background knowledge and have them watch like a short webinar and take that. So you can really be playful and thinking about like independent tasks that your class can do. And you have to show them that these conferences are super valuable, so they understand how serious it is that like you're meeting and doing that. It helps, this was a big reason why I'd like have student teachers. They could do some of this work. I had a co-teacher, he could do some, you can have kids meet with, there's all different types of ways you can play around with it. But that's my pitch for writing conferences and why like I think it's really cool. I agree the 33 kid thing is complicated, but you guys are all really smart and I think can like figure out different ways and different avenues of engaging with that.
So I'm not going to let you off the hook that quickly. Sarah Beck here is calling you an organizational genius. So I think some of these things are like you can figure it out. Are clearly that's in your wheelhouse. But let's dive into some of these logistics. So how long are they?
I mean, they're anywhere between 5. They've gone as long as 15 minutes. Anywhere in that range, which means I could
get
on
a timer.
Yeah, usually. I mean, I have it in my head kind of generally. That's a great question though. I mean, it depends on really like where we are in the writing process. If we're like writing a big paper, then I'm like conferencing with kids for the whole time. Other kids are writing, so that's really a really easy time to do a kind of conferences. When we hand back papers or kids are taking a written quiz, that can be another really good time to do it. So again, it comes down to, engineering these moments. You're right, they don't just happen, right? You have to engineer these moments in your class so that you can kind of have that capacity to do it.
So a kid comes in, so you've assigned this writing assignment, right? And they're working on stuff and you're like, okay, Jenny, come on up and let's talk. Have you read what she's done so far? Like, is there any prep that you do beforehand?
It depends. It really depends on where we are in the writing process.
So let's say you're like, so wait, hold on. Where you are are you doing more than one writing process conference with kids in a writing cycle?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, at times. If we're doing like a research project, yeah, that's kind of the mode that class becomes. So it becomes the way that class runs. Yeah.
How many weeks are you devoting to this?
couple weeks. Yeah, I don't know, Sarah's seen it. Yeah, it's a couple weeks of write, or 5 days of writing, 2 days of revision. So yeah, it's a huge time commitment, and I think it is worth it. It is worth it.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. I want to hear a little bit more. So when you, so let's take like student X. Okay, student X, you meet with them in the beginning, and you kind of assess how they're doing with the reading, and so then you send them back. You're like, okay, cool, get back to the reading. Come here, student Y. Okay.
Yep.
Then you meet back with student X like the next week, and they've maybe outlined something, and you realize they maybe don't have a sense of the chronology.
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, oh, hold on, let me stabilize the content. I'm going to talk at you. Here's what actually happened during the French Revolution. Okay, go for it. You're good to go. You meet with them the next week, and now they've written a few paragraphs, and you realize that, like, what's something you might realize?
I mean, there's a million different things, right? It could be that they're like claim, like we could be looking at their claim. It's like, oh, like your evidence is actually way more complicated than your claim. Let's talk about, and so doing some more, oftentimes students come in with a claim versus like starting with the evidence and then going to the claim. And so we might sort of reverse engineer their claim and think about how using modifiers like although, however, can allow us to make a more specific and kind of couch the argument within the discipline in more complicated ways. But again, I wouldn't know that if I hadn't like met with the kid. And I'm taking notes too. That's the other thing, is I have these running records about like my interactions with the kid and like what we worked on. So that can be really helpful to sort of keep your mind going on where kids are at.
So you basically have, you're case managing. You basically have like each kid has kind of a set of notes, and you're tracking them. So when you read that kid's final essay, are you looking for the thing that you worked on with that kid?
Yeah, oftentimes. Yeah, that's like usually the grading goes way faster because you're like already pretty familiar with it. And then if you have a bunch of kids, if you obviously this is easier if you have like more teachers in the room. If you're teaching, I taught an inclusion class, so I had it taught with a special educator, and so we just split the class. And we had these writing mentors, and like they just meet, they know us really well by the end of the year. That's the other thing about this that I think is really core, is getting to like actually meet with kids and have them like really get to know you, right? You're like talking to them and like,
yeah. I have one more question that's grilling you on this approach, and Eric, then I'm going to go to you and ask, like, what do you think of all this? My last question is, so you've done all this stuff. What are you looking for in the writing? Okay, that thing that you said doesn't reveal all the thinking necessarily, right? That's how you kind of open it. So what are you looking for writing, the qualities in the writing that make it historical?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm really like looking at, I care about the domain specific, I'm doing some of the domain specific moves. So that might be corroboration. And it depends on the unit and what I'm teaching, right? Sometimes I'm just like, all I'm going to look at is corroboration. That's it. If they've done that, cool. And that's all I'm going to grade for. That's it. It's the only thing I'm going to get feedback on. All my conferences are going to be about that. Really, really, again, I'm all about like less is more. Let's just like really hammer this thing. And then next unit, we'll do sourcing. Cool. And we'll just like focus on that. So it really just depends. Like I'm really big into only assessing stuff that I've taught. So, the first unit, we might just do corroboration, and that's all I'm going to assess is like, are they corroborating sources? Cool. And my rubrics that I build are like just aligned to that one particular thing. And then we keep making it more complicated, and we keep like taking away scaffolds, de-scaffolding, right? There should become a point where I shouldn't have to say corroborate sources, right? Should be able to take that away by the end of the year. And they should just be like, cool, that's what we're doing. That's how we like write about history. But yeah, it's really couched like in those kind of domain specific moves.
So this is a numbers question. You're teaching 10th grade.
Yeah.
How many, like on average, student X, how many times have you met with them from September to June?
I don't know. I mean, it depends on the, with 9th graders, we were doing this I have no idea. I mean, with 9th graders, we're doing it every week. So I don't, for a whole semester, we did it every Thursday. With 10th graders, their first year, we did it, every other week or so. Again, it's a time commitment, but I really think that like, when we think about how students are coming from so many different places as writers, and we're expecting writing to be meaningful, right? The big assumption is that I think writing should be meaningful and not just like we create a product. then teaching a whole class to me doesn't really make that much sense. And we also, I guess, I come from a kind of deep liberal arts college background where like meeting and going to office hours was like a core kind of thing that allowed you to sort of get to know your people and find your mentors. So like that's really built into this, and I think is really important.
So Erik, I'm going to turn to you, and let me pose one more thing to Andy that I want him to think about while you kind of riff on this. Andy, this is so unusual for this much attention to writing in social studies.
Yeah.
I mean, just atypical is the only way to describe it, right? So what do you think, for teachers who have not identified as writing teachers, even teachers who do inquiry, who like reading stuff, right? But they just haven't been doing the writing stuff. What would you say is kind of like, they want to dip their toe in the water, they want to feel good, they want to see what their kids might be able to do. Just want you to think about like, what is the advice you would give them as step one? And Erik, what do you think about all this?
Sure. Okay. I want to point out real quick that the word essay, right? And maybe Greg is in the chat and he can give us the official historical derivation of that word. But essay comes from the French. It means to try, to make an attempt, right? And so when we ask students to write essays, for many of them, it's just an intimidating process. It's usually high stakes. It's scary. They feel like they're not good at it. They haven't had time to practice. And so I think that with a little bit of creativity from the teacher about what that writing is, what it looks like from the students, how can we sort of demystify it a little bit? How can we make it less scary? How can we make it feel more like an attempt, right? I'm just trying. And so I think when we approach students with essay writing, we've really got to make an attempt to make it not scary for them. A really great thing that Andrew brought up, one way to do that is, let's take that rubric, whatever it is. I mean, students are intimidated by rubrics too. Like, geez, it's scary here, right? But what if we look at just one row of that rubric? I really want you all just working on a claim in this essay. Yes, I want you to write the whole essay, but I really want you to lock down your claim. I really want you to learn how to cite evidence, right? Because there's all these moving parts and pieces, and essays are super complicated and complex. And so I think there's great value in simplifying that process that Andrew brought up. I fully agree with that. In my class, let's see, we use a combination. I don't, to the extent that Andrew interviews and sits down in conferences with his students, I don't do it to that extent. However, I will say that students respond extremely well to it. They love sitting down, they love chatting. They can chat about other stuff besides school. It just gives you a really great connection point to students too. In fact, throughout the course, I give students a lot of different ways of how they want to show their knowledge. And so many of them want to just have a one-on-one interview with the teacher. They're like, look, I just want to sit down with you and tell you what I know and what I've been working on. Of course, that is a whole different set of skills than essay writing. And I'm not convinced, I mean, I'm probably going to not be so popular here, but I'm not convinced that essay writing is the end all be all. It is extremely valuable. It is extremely important, but there are so many other different ways that students can demonstrate what they know. Most of those, like secretly in the background, are connected to writing though, right? We have to script things, we have to organize, we have to come up with an idea, we have to come up with our evidence. And so there's lots of different ways that we can approach how students show off what they've learned. I've kind of gone all over the place. I think my big takeaway for writing in a social studies classroom is we got to have the students write. Our students come away at the end of the year going, oh my God, I wrote more essays in here than I did in my English class. Like, good, like it's practice, let's go. And the other thing is, like, we really need to incentivize these students to respond to writing. We need to figure out ways to make it less scary, less intimidating. Maybe that's like a grade book thing. Maybe it's the incremental approach that we've talked about here. But there's lots of different ways that we can coax students into writing.
Excellent, excellent. So, Andy, I had prompted you to identify like a first step. Do you have one?
Yeah. I think the easiest way to do this is to look at some student work, pick 3 kind of key things that kids are finding challenging, develop 3 little short mini lessons that you can just do in these conferences, pick the kids you want to work with and who need this with the particular things, and just do it. Again, have an independent task that the other students in the class can do, and that all the other stuff I was talking about. But I really think like the simple way is just like, yeah, pick a couple things kids are finding challenging, have some little mini lessons in your back pocket, and just start meeting with kids who you know like will find this useful. And you can even meet with like 3 kids. You're like, oh, well, all these kids are struggling on claim. 3, come up here. That's great.
I love that idea of, first see what kids are actually doing instead of getting stuck in your head about what they might struggle with, right? Like that you can actually get some stuff in your hands, some student work. That goes for reading too. Like, what do kids do with this map? Let's see. Maybe the thing that I thought was going to, really confuse them didn't, but this other thing did, right? And so a lot of this is experimental in that way. We're closing out on time, and there's a big thing that we haven't touched on, something that's very close to my heart. When we think of literacy, we think of reading, we think of writing, but speech, and Erik, you just talked about this, right? This discourse is another huge domain, right? Where that we should consider a form of literacy. Can each of you talk about how you use student discourse to support, Andy, in some ways this is baked into the conferences, but I'm talking about actually whole class. Like, how do you use student discourse in the class to support these other literacy goals like reading and writing?
Yeah, sure, I'll hop in. Yeah, sure, I'll hop in.
I feel like I've been talking a lot. Go for it.
Yeah, and I just saw a comment from Savannah in the chat that echoes this same sentiment, right? These oral presentation skills, maybe we call them, or just the ability to, and it doesn't even have to be public speaking, right? It's just the ability to articulate your thoughts. And so one way that we encourage students to do this, that really segues with the fact that students can be intimidated by writing, is I might have an assessment that says something like, look, you can either give me a written response, or maybe you want to record something. And I saw Flipgrid go by in the chat as well. Maybe you want to record yourself talking to the class, or maybe you just want to have a one-on-one with me. The really cool thing about doing that is students will say, okay, yeah, I don't want to write an essay for sure. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to pick this verbal option and give a class presentation. Well, what they soon realize is that they're going to be writing everything down anyway, right? And so it often starts with an outline. They realize they need to bring more in. They need to bring in some facts, some evidence, something that we've learned. They need to have an introduction. They need to have a conclusion. And so by the process of creating this like script, they have accomplished a pretty big chunk of the writing process. Is it ideal? Does it look perfect? No, probably not. But it is moving that student forward, right? They're allowing themselves, or they're giving themselves an opportunity to dip their toes in that writing process, maybe without even realizing it first. And so there are so many different ways that students can practice those presentation skills. We do a lot of collaborative work in our class, and so those might look like the infamous group presentations, but again, with some guardrails set up or some requirements for those groups, it really gives students a chance to practice that. Some of you have seen the numbers, right? The research numbers, but like something like in a history classroom, like an average student speech time is something like less than 2 minutes, which is really, really sad, right? And we want students to practice using their voice for much bigger goals than explaining the intricacies of the French Revolution, for example, right? We want those voices to really come out, and they need practice in our classrooms using their voices.
And to build on that, I guess I transcribe most discussions that kids have, period. And then I give them to them. And I say, look, you said, I'll have you highlight everything you said. You can use all of this as the use of how you like unpack evidence in your essay. Great, you're like halfway there. You've done all the thinking. So that's one sort of easy one, is just like, oh yeah, we're doing seminar today. So that makes that sort of speech to writing thing just extremely clear for kids. Wow. Right? They're just like literally like that's there. So I think that's a really easy one. And especially now you can just record it and put it in Otter AI, and like kids could just, they could just have it like 5 minutes later. They could have like some of the words won't be there exactly, but I think that's a really easy one. Obviously with like these dialogic assessment conferences that I was talking about, like it is incredibly verbal, and we're just talking about history. Abby, you've seen me do some of these, and it's just like talking about history with a kid for a sec and really getting into it. And so I think, both of those are some sort of easy ways. I really think the transcription, though, the more I did that, the more I like made that clear to kids, and you could just like literally give them a transcript of their thoughts, allowed them, and they'd be like, oh, wait, I referenced that document there too. So that's also really cool.
So what do you think of this as a final image, right? We have the wheel of inquiry. Literacy is in the middle, but perhaps student discourse is in the middle of that, because that's how we're getting their interpretations about texts out on the table. That's how we're understanding their misunderstandings. That's how we're supporting their composition process. That's how we're supporting their learning. What do you think of that?
Here for it.
You're here for it?
Yeah, for sure. It's the ball bearings that make the wheel go around. That's right.
Excellent. Well, we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to just end with an open question. That's, well, actually, it's a question of what is one piece of advice you would give a teacher who is nervous about starting this, starting a path to incorporating more literacy into their classroom? Erik, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm gonna say this one. Reading is reading. Whether that's comic books, whether it's scientific text, whether it's data tables, whether it's a map, right? All of those types of sources that students can see that they're exposed to really do inform something in their brain. It really does help build knowledge. And so I'm a really big believer in that phrase, that reading is reading. And so that's probably my one snippet of advice. We want kids to just be reading.
Okay.
Pick something your kids are finding challenging, start meeting with them to help them get better at it.
Okay.
One-on-one, yeah. But really, like, not that hard. It could be anything, but I think with writing, it's a little more concrete, but that's it. Start meeting with kids one-on-one, please.
What I'm hearing across both of your answers is that I think when we situate this as inquiry, which we started this whole discussion
Yes.
doing, right? That's both helpful, right, as a conceptual frame, and also extremely intimidating, right? Because what does it mean to take this unit that I've been doing for X number of years and turn it into an inquiry unit and bring in all these sources and modify them and prepare them for kids? And I think that, start somewhere, anywhere, take a small chunk off, test it out, build, tweak it, try it again, and see where it goes, and we can go from there. Anyway, it's been so wonderful talking to both of you today.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Abby.
I am so fired up right now about writing in the history classroom. Thanks so much, Abby, Erik, and Andrew. So many great tangible tips and takeaways. We really appreciate you all joining us today.
Thanks so much.
All right, so this crew gave us a lot of great fodder and topics for our live discussion after party. What is the after party, you might be wondering? Glad you asked. It is a discussion thread that's about to be posted into the chat. Check it out and keep the conversation going on this fantastic live discussion. There's so much more to talk about together. We will return at 12:30 p.m. Pacific, 3:30 p.m. Eastern for our final live discussion. This one is on really current events and you won't want to miss it. But before we head over to that final session, please complete our 2-question Zoom poll on this live discussion. Your responses are really valuable to us. We'll see you back here very soon.